The Young and the Restless spoilers. It was a cold, moonless night when Sharon finally broke her silence. The weight of her guilt had become too much to bear, and the secrets she had hidden so deeply now clawed their way to the surface. In the dimly lit living room, Sharon stood trembling before Nick, Mariah, and Faith, her hands shaking as she wiped away tears. The truth was finally out. I did something terrible, Sharon's voice cracked, barely audible, but the horror in her eyes said everything. Nick, Mariah, and Faith exchanged worried glances, the room thick with tension. Sharon continued, her voice faltering. Heather, her body, it's in the trunk of my car. The silence that followed was deafening. Nick's face twisted in shock, as though the words Sharon had just spoken didn't make sense. Heather was dead, and Sharon, the woman he had loved for so long, had killed her? It was a truth too horrific to comprehend. Mariah gasped, her hands covering her mouth, while Faith's eyes filled with disbelief. Nick couldn't believe what he was hearing. Sharon, the mother of his children, had killed someone, but even as the realization hit him, he felt something unexpected. A fierce, unshakable desire to protect her. He couldn't allow her to go to prison. He wouldn't let the mother of his children suffer for a momentary lapse in judgment, no matter how dark the consequences were. Sharon, Nick's voice was firm, steady, but there was a softness in his tone. I don't care what you did. I'm not letting you take the fall for this. You won't go to prison. His heart pounded as he glanced at Mariah and Faith, who were staring at him, wide-eyed, trying to understand what their father was saying. What are you talking about, Nick? Mariah's voice was tinged with fear and confusion. This is serious. We can't just... We can, and we will, Nick interrupted, his voice filled with resolve. Heather's body, we have to bury it. We can't let this ruin everything. Sharon isn't going to prison, not if I can help it. The words hung heavy in the air, each one a weight pressing down on them. Mariah and Faith couldn't believe what they were hearing. This wasn't just about Sharon anymore. This was about the entire family being drawn into a nightmare they could never escape from. Sharon, her face pale and tear-streaked, looked at Nick with a mix of disbelief and sorrow. You'd do that? You'd help me cover this up? Nick nodded, his expression grim but determined. I'll do anything to protect you, Sharon. I don't care what it takes. The plan was hastily formed. They couldn't involve Mariah and Faith directly. It was too dangerous. If things went wrong, the girls needed to be able to claim ignorance. Nick and Sharon would handle everything. Nick had already scouted a remote location, a desolate plot of land far from prying eyes. That's where they would bury Heather, where her body would be hidden from the... It was a plan born out of desperation, and as Nick gathered the shovels, the gravity of what he was about to do began to sink in. He was about to become an accomplice in the cover-up of a murder. But in his mind, it was all for Sharon. He couldn't let the mother of his children be locked away, not for a mistake like this. No one would ever know. They would keep it a secret. A dark shadow lurking just beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect lives. That night, Nick and Sharon drove to the isolated field, Heather's lifeless body wrapped in a blanket in the trunk. Sharon sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling as the enormity of what they were about to do pressed down on her. Nick's face was a mask of determination, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. There was no turning back now. When they arrived, the air was cold, biting at their skin. The land was barren, the stars obscured by thick clouds. It felt like the world itself was conspiring to keep their secret hidden in the darkness. Nick grabbed the shovels from the back of the car and began to dig, the sound of metal striking earth echoing in the silence. Sharon stood by, her arms wrapped around herself as she fought back the sobs threatening to escape. They worked in silence, digging a grave for Heather, a woman who had once been part of their lives. But now, she was just a body, a burden they had to bury to protect themselves. Once the hole was deep enough, Nick carefully lifted Heather's body from the trunk and lowered it into the earth. Sharon's knees buckled as she watched, tears streaming down her face. This was it, the moment where everything changed. Nick covered the body with dirt, his hands shaking as he patted down the final layer. The grave was shallow, hastily dug, but it would be enough to keep the secret hidden, for now. As they stood over the freshly turned soil, Nick turned to Sharon, his face grim. It's done. No one will ever find her. Sharon nodded, but there was no relief in her eyes. Instead, there was only regret and guilt. She had killed someone, and now her entire family was implicated in the crime. How had it come to this? They drove home in silence, but the weight of what they had done followed them like a dark shadow. Back at the house, Mariah and Faith were waiting, their faces pale with fear and anxiety. They didn't know the details, and Nick intended to keep it that way. "We took care of it," Nick said quietly, his eyes tired and haunted. "It's over." But it wasn't over. Not really. The act of burying Heather was only the beginning. Now they had to live with the knowledge of what they had done. Every day would be a new challenge, keeping their secret hidden, making sure no one ever found out. But how long could they keep this up? And what would happen if someone started asking? As days passed, Nick's paranoia began to grow. Every knock on the door, every phone call felt like it could be the moment when their secret was exposed. Sharon, too, was unraveling. The guilt was eating away at her, and she found it harder and harder to look at herself in the mirror. Mariah and Faith were caught in the middle, knowing that something terrible had happened, but too afraid to ask for more details. They could sense the tension, the darkness that had settled over their family, but they didn't dare push for answers. And then one night, there was a knock at the door. Nick's heart stopped as he opened it, his mind racing with fear. Standing there was a police officer, his expression serious. "We've had a report," the officer said. "Someone saw a car matching your description near an isolated area a few nights ago. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Nick's blood ran cold. The secret they had worked so hard to bury was threatening to resurface. Would this be the moment everything fell apart? Would they all be dragged into the light, forced to face the consequences of their actions? The family had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had become monsters. Varying monsters, burying their humanity along with Heather's body. But now, their darkest secret was teetering on the edge of discovery, and the consequences could destroy them all. Would they get away with it? Or would the truth come crashing down, tearing their family apart forever?